Welcome. So glad all of you are here. I am excited to talk about this topic today because I have a feeling many of us have a lot of pain points around folks that drive us absolutely crazy. You know the ones, the people who make going into the office each day a serious struggle, or you know that attending a meeting with them is going to go south because they always have a negative attitude. Lots of us have marks on our forehead from banging it against the wall over and over again, wishing those employees, whether they're our peers, our direct reports, or even our leaders, would wake up tomorrow morning being new and improved. But sure enough, it's the same old the next day. Luckily, we're going to talk about some great techniques to help you get through these tough and tricky such situations. So let's walk through the agenda of what we've got going for you today. First, we want to review some toxicity stats from research we conducted at Fierce. Next, we will talk about the various forms that toxicity takes in our organizations. And most importantly, we'll discuss how to create change. What are some specific ways in which we can enable better and healthier behavior? So who am I? My name is Rana Dietrich. I'm the SVP of Learning here at Fierce, and I wish that I could tell you that I do not have a ton of experience with toxic employees, but in fact I do, because I have the privilege of hanging out with hundreds and hundreds of our clients. And no matter where I go, which organization or company I'm with, to some degree, every organization is impacted by this toxicity. And of course, it varies from place to place, but it's a common experience that all of us share. So I'm excited to be able to talk to you about this today and hopefully give you some really strong takeaways that you can start applying at work and just in your lives in general. One little housekeeping piece, you can see the box that makes it available for you to type in questions or comments. And if you do have questions throughout this webinar this morning, please feel free to type those in. My trusty assistant, Rebecca, is here, and she is collating and curating all those so that we can address those at the end of this webinar, assuming that we have time to do that. So this statement is one of the things that drew me to work for Fierce. And frankly, no matter how many times I have trained this content, this is still my very favorite quote. While no single conversation is guaranteed to change the trajectory of a career, a company, a relationship, or a life, any single conversation can. Any single conversation can. You know, we can think back to those single conversations that had we not paid attention to in the moment, had we not been mindful and heard what that person was trying to say to us, could have put us on a completely different trajectory right now, a totally different path and we would be having a much different experience. So it's really important that we are mindful about the conversations that are taking place around us as they occur, to be asking ourselves, is this something that I need to be paying attention to? Sadly, this is all too rarely the case with toxic employees. More times than not, there are lots of conversations that are trying to be had with that person, but they're not paying attention to them. They ignore and disregard what's being said, and ultimately, whether they know it or not, they're taking themselves in a far different trajectory. Now, we might wish that they were more awake to and aware of their behavior, but at the end of the day, we're the ones who need to have the conversations, no matter what. This is ultimately at the heart of dealing with toxic employees. We can't do anything about another person's behavior if we don't step up and talk to them about what is going on. So, who are these toxic employees? What do they look like? What are their actions? We have just some characterizations of them here, and I'm going to talk through them super quickly, and you can see who of these relate to your experience. So first up, Debbie Downer. She always seems to have a dark cloud over her head. Unfortunately, she doesn't even have enough energy to be the devil's advocate. She mostly just shuffles along and complains about pretty much everything. Then we have manipulative Mark, who basically tries to get people to do what he wants and then takes all the credit after they've accomplished it. Let's not forget about negative Nelly. She's the person who, no matter what, will always find something negative about any situation. We have critical Chris. You can completely rely on this person to always find something to criticize. And finally, we have never wrong Nick. We all know this person, someone who refuses to accept that anything they do is ever wrong. Even more, they can't handle any form of critique. Now, as you hear me describe these folks, I'm guessing you already know exactly who I'm talking about. You can picture them, even though the names have been changed to protect the innocent, or the guilty in this case. These are people you've worked with, aren't they? Or maybe you still deal with them. Maybe they're still in your midst. Let's find out. We want to take a quick poll and measure just how strong the impact of toxic employees is in your workplace. Clearly, the impact is significant, and of course, it varies depending on your culture, your industry, and the people themselves. But for the sake of the poll here today, let's work with 3 options. I'm going to describe them to you, and then we'll vote. So the first option is very strong. This is the impact of toxic employees in your workplace. Very strong. Toxic employees permeate our culture. People avoid them, and work and results are being impacted because no one knows how to confront their negative influence. Next option would be pockets. They're around, but they only exist in these small pockets, excuse me. They can suck the energy out of a room or a meeting, to be sure, and it's hard to know what to do about the impact they're having on their peers. And then the third option, they're close to non-existent. We hardly ever feel the influence of toxic employees. People are kind, honest, and mature. So there's your 3 choices. Go ahead and vote. Watching numbers. And they keep adjusting. So we were at only 3% in very strong, and now it's jumped up to 49, with about 53% in small pockets, 7% non-existent. So we keep popping back and forth, but mostly we're pretty close between the very strong and the small pockets. And I would say that the small pockets is probably the one that's winning. So definitely the numbers can be all over the map here, and we're in these first 2 buckets for the most part, which could very well be why you're on this call today, because this is a true thing for you. You know, in some organizations, the impact is far lower and the influence of toxic employees isn't completely overwhelming. But even if that's the case, it's an issue we still have to work with. Toxic people create a negative work environment, whether they're the majority or the minority. It's that simple and straightforward. So we've seen your results. Now let's look at some data that we have gathered. Fierce surveyed over 1,000 employees and executives in multiple organizations that ranged from healthcare to education and manufacturing to the financial sector. You can see the stats here on the screen. Overall, 78% of employees say that negative attitudes are extremely debilitating to team morale. Extremely debilitating, not just slightly debilitating. 17% of those surveyed say negative attitudes increase stress, and 27% of employees say that negative attitudes decrease productivity. So we can just acknowledge what's true. Negative environments usually create workarounds. We tiptoe around. We try to avoid toxic, negative employees. And how does that affect us? Well, it increases our stress. It increases our distractions. And let's do the math. Think about how much time it takes away from getting real work done. We also discovered that 62% of employees opted to confront toxic coworkers. Now that is an awesome statistic. 62% of you say that you know you need to have difficult conversations and actually have them. Good for you. But even with that news, here's what we also learned. 78% of employees claim that their organizations are extremely tolerant of colleagues with negative attitudes. Ouch. So when we put these two things together, here's the takeaway. You, as an individual, may very well be doing what you can to address toxic behavior, but your organization as a whole doesn't seem to be tackling the problem. Sometimes the reason for this is because toxic employees can be our highest performers. They're not like Debbie Downer, who shuffles around and barely does her job. They actually generate revenue and production, and we can't afford to lose their numbers, their contribution. So we don't confront. We don't say what needs to be said, at least at an organizational level, and we let their behavior go. Jim Collins offers us this wisdom: great vision without great people is irrelevant. We can have all the vision we want, but if we've got toxic employees on our team, we are not going to be the best we can be. It's a recipe for disaster when we do not address these employees and their behavior or attitudes. It's a recipe for disaster when we don't create an environment where we can have the conversations needed. Let's look just a little bit more closely at what happens when we don't address toxic employees. First, we create an environment where people are disengaged. A recent Gallup poll says 87% of the global workforce is unengaged. That is such a sad statistic. That's depressing. It's shocking to me, actually. Part of the reason why this number is so high is because people don't feel like they belong when they're part of an organization in which they can't actually connect or experience a sense of community and shared values or mission. Instead, they're surrounded by some pretty negative employees who aren't happy to be there. The second factor we encounter is that people feel overworked. Did you know, according to Business News Daily, that 42% of working adults are willing to give up some percentage of their salary in exchange for more flexibility at work? And here's another piece of data. 80% of workers feel stress on the job, and nearly half say that they need help learning how to manage that stress. Even more shocking, 29% of these employees have actually yelled at coworkers because of workplace stress. So we have to ask ourselves, is this what's causing toxic employees? So I'm sitting here feeling stressed out, and I might show up as the toxic employee myself. The other possibility is that I'll have to interact with a toxic employee, which then creates my stress. It's just this vicious cycle of cause and effect. All right, let's take another poll. What trend do you see the most when you're thinking about an environment with toxic employees? Which shows up most? Employees feeling disengaged, overworked, or stressed? All right, let's see what we have. So you're following our statistics as well. So we're still highest on disengaged, with stressed picking up the pace. No one's choosing overworked, which is interesting. So disengaged and stressed are the big ones. Yeah, and disengaged still coming in at the highest, but only by about 6 points. So all of us probably would acknowledge that on some level it's all three within our organizations, and we experience this ourselves: disengaged, stressed, and when we feel these things, those of us who are the productive ones, who aren't the toxic employees, tend to feel overworked. And I think we can probably agree that none of these options are desirable. So let's figure out what we need to do. What are some tools and ideas that could help us with the messy situations caused by toxic employees? We have 7 principles at Fierce that serve as the cornerstone of how to have the most successful conversations and truly tackle toxic employees. One of them is this: take responsibility for your emotional wake. In order to not be the toxic employees we're trying to avoid, we need to consider our own impact. How do people feel about conversation with me after I leave the room? Toxic employees often leave a tsunami in their wake. People feel far worse than better when the conversation is over. When we are not mindful of our wake, when we're consumed by our own stress or overwork or disengagement, we can become the toxic employees. And this principle helps us check our own behavior and then be responsible for that. So once we've checked in with ourselves, what do we do next? How can we best deal with others who have not taken responsibility for their emotional wake and remain toxic? Well, let's look at two specific conversations that we need to learn to have. First up is feedback. One of the best ways in which we deal with toxic, negative employees is by giving feedback and learning how to receive feedback on the spot in order to create awareness. If we have an interaction with a toxic employee and it doesn't go well, the best choice is to call it out, to name what we've experienced. But too often, we don't. If someone rolls their eyes in a meeting, we rarely say after the meeting, "Hey, I noticed that you rolled your eyes. Is there something going on there? Is there more you need to tell me about what's happening with you? Are you not happy with the ideas we're discussing or the plan? Talk with me about that." We give the feedback in the moment. If too much time lags between the behavior and me finally saying something, the other person doesn't even recall that they ever did it. But when I address it on the spot or right after the fact, chances are far higher that the other person will realize and even acknowledge what I've named. "Oh, yeah, I did do that. That did happen. Here's what I was feeling in the moment." Then they're able to do a little bit of self-assessment, check in, and be able to express where they're at. Feedback is when we name in the moment what we're seeing and experiencing in order to give the other person opportunity to better understand themselves and hopefully grow and change. Too often, though, especially with toxic employees, we've let things go unchecked for a very long time. The negative environment has taken root, and now we need to have a far deeper conversation than feedback. We need to have a confrontation conversation. So, how do we do this? How do we confront someone's toxic behavior in order to create an environment for behavior change? You know, when I teach this in the classroom, I ask participants, on a scale of 1 to 10, if you knew your behavior was driving someone crazy, if your behavior was the toxic behavior we've been discussing, would you want someone to tell you? So give yourself a 1 if you're a nope, I don't want to know, don't tell me, I'd prefer to live in the dark. And give yourself a 10 if your answer is bring it on, absolutely, let me know. Most of the time when I ask this question in class, people's numbers are probably at the 8, 9, 10. If we knew our behavior was deemed as toxic or was making other people crazy, we would want to know. And I certainly feel that way. I would want people to tell me if that were true, if that was how they were experiencing me. But here's what's ironic. When it comes to confronting other people whose behavior is making us crazy, that we've identified as toxic, we tend to keep quiet. We stay down in these lower numbers on the scale. So we would want to know, but apparently nobody else would. So most people don't confront as often as they should, even though they acknowledge that they would want people to confront them. We actively avoid these conversations. And one reason is because we're unsure as to whether or not the situation actually calls for confrontation. We're not sure if it's the right step. We think, well, maybe I can wait it out and it'll get better. It won't. Or maybe the situation will get better with a feedback conversation. It might. But it's that lingering question of not knowing that stops us from taking the needed next step. So how do you determine whether or not the situation needs a feedback conversation or a confrontation conversation. I want to go over the difference between feedback and confrontation so you can go back to your office and your life and be far better equipped for tackling these tough challenges. In a feedback situation, you know it's the correct action because the behavior you're addressing has never happened before. Or if it has happened before, it's not serious or egregious enough that it must change now. In addition, chances are high that the other person isn't even aware that they did whatever it is, whatever something is that you've labeled as toxic. It's possible that they're a one-time toxic employee. They show up, they're in a bad mood, and yeah, they sort of dump on the team a bit, but you've never seen it happen before. That's an opportunity for feedback so that they have awareness that they didn't have before. You know, feedback is so important. If I could give people one gift, it would be the gift of being able to observe themselves without knowing that's who they're watching, maybe for a week. And at the end of those days, I'd say, hey, by the way, you've been watching yourself. I am 100% certain that there would be some huge aha moments for all of us. We rarely get to see how we actually show up. We can't even see our own faces, only a reflection. And we don't even digest or hear our tone of voice and how we come across to others. Feedback is that gift. When we are able to give someone opportunity to anonymously observe themselves, they would have huge insights related to confrontation as well. So we know a confrontation is required when there's a pattern of similar behavior. You've said something before and nothing has changed, or it's not changing quickly enough. The person has done something troublesome for you, your team, or the organization, and it really can't happen again. There's an underlying issue that needs to be corrected to prevent further unanticipated mistakes. It's not feedback, it's more, it's urgent, and it requires our preparation. So let's look closer at what effective confrontation is all about. You know, for most of us, confrontation feels like danger, warning, stay away. We have this sort of visceral response the second that this even crosses our mind. In fact, we even use language that is confrontational to describe these kinds of conversations. We say, I'm going to go toe to toe or head to head with this person. We're going to duke it out. Understandably, when this is our perspective, we go into the conversation armed and armored. I've got my shield and my sword. Now, if I go in armed and armored, I can almost guarantee that the other person will need to defend themselves, or worse, attack me back. Instead of going into this conversation with the mindset of a conqueror, what if I went in with the mindset of an explorer? Instead of, I'm going to attack this toxic employee and finally take this challenge on, I could see confrontation as a search for the truth through a conversation. It's not one way. Even the word conversation gives us a helpful tip or clue. Those first three letters, C-O-N, cone, in actually both the word conversation and confrontation mean with in Spanish. We're having a conversation with someone, not at someone or to someone. You want to be with the other person in front of the issue, searching for the truth. You want to stand side by side with them, shoulder to shoulder, diving deep into the issue and looking at all the details so that you can both fully understand each other and come to an agreement and a new understanding together. I'm going to walk through the steps of preparing for a confrontation conversation with you. And we're going to make the video recording of this available to you after the webinar. So no worries, you can just listen in at this stage and not have to worry about taking notes. So you might be asking yourself, how do I even begin this conversation? Well, preparation is key. If we go into a confrontation conversation winging it, we're in danger of putting all sorts of lovely adjectives into our conversation and potentially coming across in an attacking way, not paying attention to our emotional wake. We might leave that wake that we talked about earlier. So to help us step into this well, we need to create what we at Fierce call our 60-second opening statement. We call it that because it should literally take no more than a minute. Now, it takes more than a minute to prepare, but no more than a minute to deliver. That's not the duration of the entire conversation. It's just the beginning. It's you saying, here are my thoughts about the situation at hand right now. And then we open it up to a two-way conversation. But this first 60 seconds is your opportunity to share how you perceive the situation, how it's impacted you, and how it's impacted others in the organization. So the first step in our opening statement is to name the issue. You want to clearly state the effect the toxic person's behavior has had. You want to name the behavior specifically and what it's impacting. So for example, you might say, I want to talk with you about the effect your communication style is having on the team. Now, I like to use nice, big, broad subjects like communication style, work style, leadership style, simply because it opens the conversation up for a lot of different interpretations. Excuse me. You'll notice that in the next step, we're going to select a specific example that illustrates this. So you don't have to say, I want to talk with you about what happened yesterday in the meeting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The first sentence doesn't need nuance, just clarity. You know, often toxic employees fall into a category of attitude problems. Still, listen to this. I need to talk with you about your hostile attitude and the effect it's having on the defenseless team. Can you hear how this language will immediately put them on the defense? They'll feel like they're being attacked. Instead, we would say, I want to talk with you about your communication style and the effect it's having on the team. Then in step 2, we're going to give an example. Yesterday, when Sharon started sharing her idea, you interrupted her, talked louder, and changed the subject. So do you hear the specifics after the more general start? When you're giving the example in this step, one of the things you want to do is describe it directly and specifically. No extra special adjectives here. You want to be as clear as you can be, as though a video camera recorded exactly what happened. Then in step 3, we are going to name how this has impacted us. You'll name how this has impacted you. You want to get some skin in the game here by talking about the effects this behavior is actually having on you, your emotions around this issue. And a note here, I want to call out that you want to describe your emotions, not act them out. We don't need to be pounding our fists on the table, raising our voice and saying, I am so angry, or do you know how frustrated I am with you? Instead, you want to say, I'm frustrated, I'm upset, I'm concerned, I'm surprised. Including my emotions when I'm giving my 60-second opening statement is part of the with in confrontation and conversation. I'm with you in this. I have emotions related to this, and I'm willing to be vulnerable and transparent enough to let you know how you are impacting me at a feeling level. Then step 4 is where we have opportunity to clarify why what we're saying is important. You know, the why is often left out of conversations, especially confrontation conversations with our employees or peers. I've heard myself say in my own mind, why can't they just get this? Don't they know that their behavior is driving everybody crazy? How can anybody not see how crazy this is? So we don't want to go there. Instead, we want to say what is happening and why their behavior or attitude change is important for the team, for the organization, even for our relationship. And I'd encourage you to use the words at stake here because of the impact that can make on the other person, their ability to understand your why. And you wouldn't have to make it all negative either. It could be what's at stake to gain if we can correct this, or what's at stake to lose for you, for others, for the team, for the organization. Now, step 5. This can be the most difficult part of this opening statement and of the confrontation conversation in itself. This is where you identify your contribution, your part in this. When I'm confronting toxic behavior, it's probably nothing new. That's when we give feedback, right? So in truth, I have actually allowed this to happen. I've seen patterns being established and I didn't step in when I needed to. I should have taken responsibility for my part. And so I could say, my part in this is that I did not bring it to your attention sooner. Or my part in this is that I did not step in and provide you clear expectations along the way. If you have a contribution to the issue, you really need to name it. If you don't, trust me, the employee will tell you how you contributed when you turn it over to them. Then step 6 is where you indicate your wish to resolve the issue. Let's pause for just a second here and name that it is so important to remember that we are not using this 60-second opening statement as a 60-second closing statement. This is not a termination conversation. It should not be, I really don't want to resolve this issue with you, thank you very much. Instead, you want to express that you really do want to get the issue resolved with this person. Have your ideal outcome be that the behavior changes for the better, for them, for the team, and for the organization. This is what I want to resolve with you, the effect your leadership style is having on the team. We state that we want to resolve, and then we just repeat the issue we named at the very beginning in step number 1. Then last but not least, step number 7, you want to simply invite them to respond. Help me understand what's going on from your perspective. And that's it. That's the 60-second opening statement. All 7 of those steps happen in 1 minute or less. Now, sometimes people ask, well, what if they interrupt me in the middle of this? The good news is that if it's really 1 minute or less, you can actually say, this is going to just take a minute and then I'll be all ears. I want to turn it over to you and hear your thoughts. Often, especially with toxic employees, we've seen a pattern of behavior that we're stressed about. We've been preparing this conversation mentally in our mind. Sometimes we even take this person home with us in our mind and set a place for them at the dinner table. We complain about them again and again to our family or our friends. We say, you are never going to believe what this person did again today. So we've been thinking about this toxic employee for a very long time. But what we need to remember is that they have only had 60 seconds to realize that there's a problem. We can expect that they are going to go into the normal physiological reactions that occur when they're caught off guard. The blood rushes from their brain and goes straight to their hands and feet for fight or flight. Their body is sitting calmly across from you, but their mind is somewhere else. And they can go into various reactions, all of which we should expect. And the most common reactions we see at Fierce are deny, defend, and deflect. In denial, they really don't see that they're part of the problem. I didn't do it. This never happened. I don't know what you're talking about. It wasn't me. In defend, they'll say something like, well, you know what? I did do that, but you need to understand why I had to. Or I did do that, but you should have seen what they said. Or I did do that, but if I'd had the kind of training I needed, that wouldn't have happened. So I defend my behavior somehow. And then in deflection, I need to be able to get the attention off of me as fast as possible. It's not about me. It's about them. It's about you. It's about other people. So it's often a clever toxic employee who will say, why are you having this conversation with me? Sally's way worse than I am. Have you heard the way she talks to other people? Talk about toxic. Sally's the most toxic one. I think we can understand that if we were confronted, it would be natural for us to try and get the spotlight off of ourselves and onto other people, or to deny or defend. The problem is not that people go there when they're confronted. The problem is that we don't prepare for them to go there. We need to just expect their reactions and emotions. Remember, they're processing. They're going to be triggered, making it harder for them to have a conversation that's reasonable and rational. What you need to do is make sure you do not go there with them. So don't step into fighting. This is where having a really strong and clear and concise statement, especially step number one, the issue, is really helpful. One of the best techniques you can use when you're confronting another person is to go back to step number one and restate the issue. For example, if the other person starts making excuses, is in defense mode, you could say, Amy, we're here to talk about the effect your communication style is having on the team. Let's talk about that. You keep bringing it back. And if the other person tries to change the subject, to deflect, this allows you to have a method in place that enables you to stay calm and focused in the midst of keeping the conversation on task and not getting sidetracked by the other person's reactions or your own. We want to stay focused on interaction. And in truth, one of the best ways to help a person get out of this emotional reactionary state of mind is to ask them questions. This is a natural way to help engage their brain, as well as help them see that you're committed to being with them in the conversation. You know, we don't often think about confrontation this way, but it really is all about just getting curious, amazingly curious. It's not about arguing. It's not about selling your rightness and convincing them how wrong they are. It's going in with a curiosity mindset, asking about their point of view. Help me understand is a great phrase that you can use. Now, you've said what you needed to say in the opening statement, so your job at this point, after those first 60 seconds, is to dig for full understanding and not be satisfied with the first answer they give. Instead, say, okay, so when you said that, what did you mean by that? Again, really dig and get curious. You want to lean in, especially if their responses are very different from what you know the truth to be. You could say something like, wow, that's about 180 degrees different from my perspective. Help me understand how you see it that way. And again, it is critical to keep in mind that this is not about arguing with them about the problem. It's about discovering what things look like from their perspective. Paraphrase back what you're hearing. Really listen. Remember, this is a conversation that is a search for the truth, your shared truth together. Then once you feel that you've explored things fully, that you've asked a lot of questions, that the other person really feels heard, you want to move toward resolution. Just so you know, especially if this person's been hardwired with the toxic behavior for a long time, change is not going to happen overnight. In fact, they may not even know how to proceed, how to move forward. So let's look at some of the questions we might ask during this portion of the conversation. What have we learned? Where are we now? What's needed for resolution? Has anything been left unsaid? Have we moved? What's our new understanding? And how can we move forward given this new understanding? You know, when I think about confrontation conversations that I've had, or when I've talked to people about their experience of this, oftentimes we finally work ourselves up to a place where we can say what needs to be said. Maybe we're even eloquent enough to do that in a 60-second block of time, but we hardly ever get to the interaction and resolution stages of this conversation. We hardly ever stay in a place of curiosity, digging deeper, and rarely do we get to this place of resolution where we are reflecting on the conversation that we've just had. So these kinds of questions help us invite a larger conversation that begins to lessen the tendency toward reaction. These questions help the other person know and understand that you're really in this with them. You know, in some cases, the resolution stage of this conversation might need to be parked for a moment. You might need to say, hey, how about we reconvene in the morning? Take the night to think about this. Let their brain calm down. Let them digest what you've said, what you've talked about, so that they can come in a little bit more reasonable, a little bit more rational, and be a little bit more able to have this conversation with you. And remember, one of the best parts of framing your conversation the way we've been discussing is that you are tackling the toxic behavior shoulder to shoulder. You're in this together. You can hold each other able for all that happens next. We use this term, holding each other able, as an extension of trust. This is different than saying, I want to hold you accountable. This means that I don't know for sure if you're actually going to honor your word and follow up with what your agreement is. If that's the case, then your part is to check in with them and make sure that they're set up for success. I might say something like this: I hear what you've agreed to. I'm going to agree to X. Now, let's figure out how we're going to check in with each other in a way that's respectful so we can move forward and improve the way we interact and work together. Holding each other able. All right, so let's kind of do some wrap up here. Some of the best practices that we've seen make the biggest impact are when individuals and cultures develop their feedback giving and receiving skills at all levels, and when they don't avoid confrontation, but step into it with courage, skill, and grace. When that happens, we build a healthy culture, one that is conversation rich, where each and every person asks for feedback, not just giving it. And this especially includes the boss or the leaders of the organization. You know, all too often, the higher up we get in position or title, the more we find ourselves in a feedback vacuum. We start to tell ourselves that we've somehow arrived and now do not need any more feedback, and that's simply not true. Leaning in as a leader and saying, help me help you. How can I be more effective in how we interact together? Makes all the difference. We create a culture of feedback where everyone can receive it. We want to leverage feedback to stay current and remain curious. And then remember that feedback is just as important as confrontation, especially for a toxic employee. They're probably not all bad, nor are your good employees all good. The things they're doing well are what we can continue to reinforce and then confront when more significant and urgent change is required. We can use the 60-second opening statement to step into a confrontation conversation in the clearest and cleanest way possible. And remember to stay curious. You know, the biggest takeaway I hope you've had today above everything else is that having conversation with these folks, whether feedback or confrontation, is key, not avoiding the conversations. You can't ignore the problem, cross your fingers and hope it goes away, because it won't. And as you've seen, you and your organization suffer. Also, super important to remember that for the toxic employee, it's often a big wake-up call when their behavior or attitude is named, whether through feedback or confrontation. You will see some pretty profound and positive changes in your organization as the person starts to realize how they've impacted people around them. Again, conversation makes all the difference. When we have the conversations needed, again, feedback and confrontation, when we practice them and build our capacity and muscle, we actually begin to turn our toxic employees into fully functional ones and ultimately build a culture of results. So what's next? Well, one easy next step is that when we finish this webinar today, all of you will be receiving resources just after the call that will help you to step into these 60-second opening statements on your own. We're going to send you the template for that conversation so that you can fill that form out and practice that on your own, and then be prepared to step into those conversations with other people, to remember that the deny, defend, deflect is surely on the way, but that you want to stay in the interaction phase so that you can get to a new place of resolution. And finally, we want to be able to, of course, offer you additional resources to connect with you. Lots of stuff available on our website, and you can certainly hook up with us on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter. And we're even on Instagram. It's not on the slide now, but that is available also. And I would love it if you gave me some feedback. So feel free to email me at my email address here on the screen and let me know how this landed for you. Because, of course, that's part of what we're talking about, isn't it? That's how we make sure that we're constantly improving and that we can see ourselves reflected accurately. So we have some time left, and Rebecca's been taking questions as we've been talking, or as I've been talking, and I would love to be able to address some of those. So one we have here from Rose, where she says, in my organization, this sentence is commonly used, that we understand feedback's importance, but we're super busy. How can we deal with this work attitude of business leaders? Yeah, I totally get this. So we understand that feedback's really important, but we're also super stressed. We've got lots of stuff going on. And sometimes we trick ourselves, or we think that taking the time to step into feedback is going to be more time than it's worth, and we need to just keep moving forward. And the question I often ask people when I hear this is, if we add up what the cost is in time of the things that we have to do over again, of the work that's not done at the highest level of productivity that it needs to be done at, of the lack of engagement, the disengagement, the stress, all the things that we talked about at the beginning, that's costing us far more time than actually taking the time to give feedback in the moment. So, I think if we build the muscle of giving feedback 24/7, 365, just noticing people's behavior. Here's what I'd like you to do more of. Here's what I'd like you to do less of. Here's the praise and recognition that you deserve. Here are the things that you could improve. If we were consistently doing that in the moment, we would find that that's probably not taking near as much time as the cost of not giving it costs us later on. So Kate says, I wonder if you can give those of us managing a team hints on how to foster a positive attitude toward feedback, particularly when inheriting a team that has had negative experiences before. Yeah, absolutely. So I hear this sometimes, like if you are a manager or a director or a leader that takes on a team that was led by someone else previously, and feedback either was non-existent or was not given well, people are not all that receptive to you now stepping into a place of trying to give feedback. So I would say the first way to start building um, a new way of thinking about feedback or experiencing feedback is to start with what you recognize, that what you appreciate, the things that you can see and recognize in them that they're doing well. People desperately need that kind of feedback just as much, if not more, than they do the constructive feedback of what you wish that they were doing differently. And I would guess, I'm not even guessing, actually, I would know this to be true, that the more that we give praise, the more that we practice this process of consistently giving positive feedback, the more open our people are when we then are giving them constructive feedback. So start with the easy wins, build the muscle, create a context in which people are looking forward to hearing what it is that you have to say, and it will make it far easier when we move into these constructive spaces. Patrick's asking, is toxic employee training geared towards a certain level of employee in the organization? Gosh, I wish I could just ask you what you actually mean by that, Patrick, and like what the situation is. Like, so if I were to just riff on this for a second, what I would say is that sadly, toxic employees don't keep themselves designated to a particular level within the organization. They're all over the place, right? From senior leadership down to brand new employees who've just walked in our door, depending on their context, their previous experiences, all kinds of things. So this training that we're working on in terms of feedback and confrontation, we would expect and certainly hope that this is being used at every level of the organization. Are the examples that I'm going to be using or the severity of the issues as extreme? with someone who has only had 6 months of experience compared to someone who's been with us for 16 years and has been toxic all that time, uh, they're not going to be the same. So the level of confrontation, the amount of specificity that I'm going to need to be able to articulate, and the importance of me really crafting my 60-second opening statement on the front end is going to be really high when I've got chronic long-term employees who have been demonstrating this kind of behavior. And maybe with the brand new employees, I want to be catching this stuff with feedback right from the get-go so that I don't have to step into the confrontation conversation. But the training in and of itself is designed to be used at any level of the organization. And at Fierce, we train this just all across the board with new hires, with C-suite. So it is equally applicable at every level. Rhonda's asking, what do you say to an employee who tells you their boss gave them feedback, but they think their boss didn't really see what they do on a regular basis and their feedback isn't accurate? Okay, so I've heard this too. I have two thoughts about this. One is if an employee were to come to me, a peer maybe, to tell me that their boss had given them feedback, but they didn't think that it was accurate. My first question would be whether or not they actually had that conversation directly with their boss. Like maybe that's what they say. Can you give me an example? Gosh, I wasn't aware that that was how you perceived my behavior. I would really like to learn more. So whether it's me or I'm hearing this secondhand from someone else, I want to default to curiosity rather than assuming that it's completely inaccurate and not worth listening to. What questions could I ask either my peer or could I encourage this employee to ask of their boss that would help them have a better understanding of why this is coming their way and what's in it for them to learn? And then I think the second thing that I would say to this one, Rhonda, is something that we talk about when we train feedback in its entirety, which is even if feedback is completely off the mark, totally out in left field, we do want to understand that somewhere in there is the gift of insight. For some reason, the person took the time to actually articulate what they thought we needed to hear. And I need to at least honor that and wonder what it is that I'm doing, saying, a way in which I'm behaving that precipitated the need for you to say something to me, even if what you said doesn't jive with my understanding of the events or the circumstances, even if the feedback is not delivered in the most effective way. All of it is offering me a gift on some level. Hopefully those are helpful. So great to have some questions from you. And you do have my email, which I gave you earlier. I'll flip back to that. So by all means, feel free to send me an email if you have some more questions as you start thinking about this, or if you're working on your 60-second opening statement. Would really love to be able to offer you any advice and encouragement and support that I and we can. Honestly, such a privilege to have you with us today. No shock. We love talking about this stuff and always have more to say about all of it. So thank you for giving us your time. Watch for further webinars that are coming up. We would love to have you join us. And again, reach out with any questions and any way that we can serve you moving forward. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.